What I want to talk about is the idea of political change. And I know this is something which is slightly relevant in the context of an coming general election. And I want to cast your mind back to the early summer of 2014, when there was an imminent election and the election seemed headed in one particular direction. And there was a lot of excitement, which is very predictable, especially in a place like India, where everything is very noisy, very rumbustious, and always very colorful. And there was a mood of alarm which went into the minds of some people. For the sake of convenience, let us call them public intellectuals. And these people believed that what India was confronted was a stark, unholy choice which would result in the fundamental destruction of India, of the idea of India. And they believed that the choices people were going to exercise were deeply uncomfortable and went against the entire grain of the Indian experience. I'm willfully not adding names to what the characters are, but I think most people understand, especially if they experienced that in 2014, in the summer of 2014. Now, 5 years later, we are confronted with yet another election. Some of that same rhetoric is likely to persist. But the question which a lot of people need to answer, especially those who raised it, is that has India changed? Has the idea of India been completely destroyed? Has India, the soul of India, been emasculated? Is it the case that we have the minorities of India cowering in their ghettos, frightened of their lives, frightened of their modes of worship, frightened of their very existence? Is it that somehow some ugly majoritarian tendencies have taken over? Has the constitution been destroyed? Now, if I raise these questions, people will say, oh, these are non-issues, really. I mean, don't exaggerate things. I'm not exaggerating. There's a certain image which was projected. So the alternative rhetoric which has come about is that, well, actually nothing has changed. India remains exactly what it was 5 years ago, and that we are 5 years later, we are experiencing a wave of utmost disappointment, an exercise in futility, false dawn, false promises, false hopes. The question really is, how do we assess political change? Has there been change? Has there been a new spirit of India which has been kindled? Now, if we can say X amount of roads have been built, X amount of some rivers have been cleaned, some electricity connections have been given, we can reel out statistics in that way. And no doubt some of these statistics are very, very impressive. I don't have all the statistics before me. But that is one facet of what a government sets out to do. A government sets out to improve the lives of people. In some cases, the lives of people improve. In some cases, it deteriorates. Overall, sometimes we have a certain feel-good factor. The stock market goes up. Sometimes it goes down. The currency fluctuates, etc., etc. But how does political change affect the lives of people, the spirit of India? has there been that change in that spirit? There are two facets which I would argue. And I'm not going into road construction, and I'm not going into electricity connections, I'm not going into gas connection, I'm not going into education policies, I'm not going into the cacophony which greets us on television every day. What are these two fundamental changes which has happened in India? The most important change, as I can see it, and I think this is something which really affects the spirit of India, the soul of India, the very basis on which we are. You know, in the late 18th century, one of the Governor Generals, Lord Cornwallis, he said, "Verily I say unto you, all the natives in Hindustan are corrupt." And in his deposition to the House of Commons, Clive said, "But giving bakshish is a standard part of Indian life. What I did was nothing unusual. And for them to give me bakshish equally was nothing unusual." The idea of a debased people whose soul had been corrupted by various things, basically a lack of sovereignty, basically a destruction of culture, etc., had been very much there. And it had permeated into the soul. And the idea that there should be no distinction between private wealth and public wealth had become very deep-rooted, especially amongst the political classes. And I think the most important change which we have noticed in the past 5 years is that for the first time since 1947, or maybe even before that, we have started rolling back the tide of corruption. Corruption hasn't ended, don't get me wrong. Corruption hasn't ended. It still exists. It still eats into the soul of India. But at one level, at the top, there has been a huge exponential drop. And that's why I'm saying we've started, the tide was always advancing. We were getting corrupt, corrupter, corruptist, maybe taking liberties with the English language. Now we've started rolling back. And that doesn't please a lot of people. And that doesn't please a lot of people, but they can't say it. So they find other ways of expressing it. Ways of expressing it depend. Saying no, they establish a moral equivalence, etc. So that's the first point, I would say. What's the second point? And that's a far more intangible, far more difficult to define. But it comes across in very small things. Attempts to clean your neighborhood. Now people say Swachh Bharat. What difference? Swachh Bharat. It has. You'll take a picture of a nala. You'll take a picture of a garbage heap. Of course there is. For every one picture you take, I'll take 5. But when was the last time, since Mahatma Gandhi, that a completely non-political issue like this was put on the public agenda? When was it? Gandhiji was the last person. He was fanatical. He was fanatical about cleanliness and bowel movements. Now, we needn't talk about the latter. But for him, politics was not merely about governance. It was how the civic public institutions of India, without aid from the government, maybe with some, but not necessarily, can actually. Then we come to the question of yoga. Now, these days, I sit in a committee which decides on awards. One of the curious features I've noticed is every single yoga teacher applies for them to think that they should get a public award. Now that's carrying things a bit too far. But what has happened, and yoga, I think, is merely symptomatic of this feature, is that there is a recognition in India that indigenous institutions, indigenous cultural facets, which we decried and which we were a little squeamish about, which we were a little embarrassed, we don't eat beef, but we don't want to say it publicly when we're on a thing. Oh, no, give me chicken, it's for health reasons. That sort of attitude. We are less squeamish about our identity as Indians. And that's not merely Indians in India, that's Indians overseas as well. They recognize that there is a meaning to India. And I still think it's in a very tentative stage. I don't think we're still actually grappled as to where we are. We feel proud, okay, we're sending someone to Mars, or we're sending someone to the moon, or whatever. We do lots of things like that. It's a little more than that. It's trying to extricate the soul from the burden of a colonial existence which had been there for 1,000 years. And that's, it's a very damning sort of thing. It really destroys you. It eats into your vitals. And that's what has happened, is that again, here too, we've started reversing that tide. We haven't succeeded. There's lots to go. There's lots. We've still got to recover our history. We've still got to recover our culture. We've got to accept the fact that the past is not always necessarily good, but we have to have that enlightenment to be able to say that this is desirable and this is not. In other words, have that enormous self-confidence to be able to address those questions. And I think we are gradually getting this. There are two types of discourses I've noticed, particularly when I'm talking to younger people. There's one who talk about postmodernism, they talk about post-feminism, and there's a complete carbon copy of the type of rhetoric, concerns which are there in the West. It's absolutely, there's no difference. I mean, just maybe the color of the skin is different, maybe the settings are a little different, but it's exactly the same. But there's another discourse which is happening. But it's still a little hesitant. I must confess that. It's still a little hesitant. But it's this attempt to recover yourself, to rediscover yourself. And I think what the political environment has done is that it's given you that space. It's given you the broad architecture to be able to try and undertake this voyage of self-discovery. How much we can do it, how much we can undertake that thing, how much we can succeed, that depends on us. That depends on us. I don't think that's got anything to do with politics. The politicians can at best create an environment. Once that environment is there, I think we can do the rest. So that's what I feel about the larger, non-political, political dimensions of this election. Of course, none of this will get discussed when the actual elections come about. That'll be a bit more bass, that'll be a bit more shrill, that'll be a louder. But somewhere underneath it, if people just remember that, I think that'll be quite instructive. Thank you very much.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Citti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.